There's this sort of myth that you've only got one sort of focus area. At least for me, I've found that not the case. I can quite regularly find a tangent or find a thread that you want to pull on, and you'll just keep pulling on that thread and pulling on that thread, and you find yourself, neck deep in Chinese military doctrine or something, and you haven't had lunch that day, but you learned a lot.
Okay, hi everyone. Today we're here with Austin, who was diagnosed with Aspergers at the age of 17 and is now completing a PhD in emerging weapons technology or something.
Basically.
Something like that. So welcome, Austin.
Hello.
And the first question I'd like to start with is, what's your favourite thing about being on the autism spectrum?
I suppose there's always sort of a professional answer to that. Mine personally is that I actually quite enjoy the special interest focus, but from the perspective of if ever I'm feeling stressed or bored, there's something I can sort of delve into and lose days at a time doing, which I find fascinating. But yeah.
So in the past, what are some things that you've delved into and spent days at a time doing?
So my sort of broad area is history, military history, specifically looking at the Russian Empire. Within that, looking at the sort of early 1800s period, so the Napoleonic Wars and the immediate aftermath, which is always lots of fun. Looking into some of the characters that were around at that period, people like Autism Tolstoy, who's a Russian general that had to have the king, the Tsar, the Emperor of Russia, had to tell him directly not to bring his bear into battle with him, because that was the plan.
Was there a good plan behind bringing a bear into battle?
No, he was just rich and
he was just
foppish.
Right, okay, fair enough. Sounds interesting. And where has that taken you in your life, that interest?
Well, that interest led into looking at terrorism and counter-terrorism studies, which led into my university degree. I did a Bachelor of Arts majoring in security and counter-terrorism as a result of that, which then led into the PhD. So where I'm looking at the PhD, it's sort of a long bow to draw back into Napoleonic history, but that's the sort of progression I went through to get there. I've sort of grown up around autism because my brother is on the spectrum as well, but I wasn't actually diagnosed until I was 17. Was at the psychologist just for the sort of checkup as you do, and she said you should really go and get tested because it's kind of obvious. And so I went, and I had my girlfriend of the time on one side and my mother on the other, and the psychiatrist is going down the list of sort of behavioural indicators, and I think I got to answer one of them.
Because they answered for you.
Yeah, he'd read one out and one of them would go, yep, he does that. Yes, he does that all the time. And I'd be like, so, most people in my sort of immediate family were not surprised. In fact, most of them thought I'd already been diagnosed long before. So
how did it feel for a professional on your family to say it's obvious and for that to land?
I mean, it's one of those things. I think depending on the family you're in, with my family, just the way we interact with each other, it was fine. The sort of nothing really changed from pre-diagnosis to post-diagnosis and how my sort of immediate family operated. It was a little bit of coming to grips with the fact that autism wasn't just what I saw in Lincoln, and he's quite different in his sort of behaviours and interests, and that sort of moved me into looking at it as much more like sort of the spectrum approach, and sort of wildly sort of variating. Well, I mean, I as you're personally aware, I was living overseas by myself in Korea for 10 months, and for 6 of that, there were no other Australians or native English speakers in the part of Korea I was in, by which I mean foreigners. Obviously, the level of English was fantastic and the people I met in Korea were great, but before I left for that trip, the sort of concept of, people with autism love routines and they love, structure, and they love things going this way or that way, and no uncertainty in their social interactions. Which
let's just go
to a country where English is a second language, and work in a lab where I was the only non-Korean and the only non-engineer. But I came through that quite well, I think. With a lot of support from the other people in my lab. But yeah, it was just one of those things. It was more a matter of, getting out of my own head and sort of stopping looking at it as a challenge, you know what I mean? As something that I should be bad at and just doing it. Where do you even start with that? The fact that, there are adults on the spectrum out and about in the world that you don't even recognise. There's the fact that, you can be 100% competent in something, 99% of the time, and then, you hit something that'll trigger, some anxiety or part of you being on the spectrum, and your sort of engagement levels just sort of drop. Which I think is interesting because, you can look at the same person on a good day and on a bad day, or in a good situation and a bad situation, and how much you believe they're on the autism spectrum is vastly different between those two things, because people seem to think that if you're on the autism spectrum, that's all there is to you. There's no other personality, there's no other interest. It's like everything about you comes back to the fact you're on the spectrum. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, when someone has a physical disability, right, people are much more capable, it seems, of separating that from the individual.
Okay.
They don't conflate those two anywhere near as much as they do with the spectrum.
Not with the personality.
With the personality is what I'm trying to say.
Like, oh, you look like you've got the personality of someone with a broken leg.
Yeah, exactly. That's just stupid when you say it like that, but people do that with autism all the time. I was doing a PD for a college out in Ringwood a couple of weeks ago, and someone asked me, like, what's the best way to, learn to work with kids on the spectrum? And I said, just go talk to one.
Yeah.
I think that's lost a little bit sometimes. I don't know with what you found, but I think that's lost a little bit sometimes when people are looking for techniques and strategies for how to engage people on the spectrum, and sometimes they forget that the best way is just go talk to one. Like,
form a relationship
with someone on the spectrum. Like, it's amazing how much you can learn just by having conversations with people on the spectrum without, any fancy qualification or degree or technique for doing so. I think that's undervalued, particularly in our society.
Yeah, it's not an easy answer to accept because it's not very specific. You're not telling me exactly what to do. You're saying go and talk to them and find out. So.
Well, isn't that supposed to be our problem?
Yeah. Ironically, yes, that's supposed to be our problem. We get all the neurotypicals saying, but I don't know what to do socially with you. Like, correct. Yeah. That is correct.
Well done, you found empathy.
I mean, by all measures, your career and studies and everything you've done has been successful as far as I've seen. Yet, at the
Glad it looks like that.
Glad it looks like that. So the public perception is that Asperger's is a deficit, or that you get diagnosed because there is some kind of a problem there, or some kind of a challenge. So how does that make sense? How can someone understand how you can seem to be successful in everything you do from the outside? Obviously, it's difficult on the inside.
I think it comes back to that concept we spoke about before with, there are other things to a person than the diagnosis. The anecdote I told at a recent thing I went to was, public speaking for me is fine, but unstructured sort of networking has always been really difficult, and that's something that I had to work on, particularly being an academic. There's a lot of talking as an academic, as it turns out, a lot of tea and biscuits. I think that's the thing. We look at the spectrum as, despite the word spectrum being in it, we look at it as this singular thing that should have these traits. We should look for these things.
Or worse, a continuum.
Yeah, you're low or high needs and low needs, whatever you want to call it. I think there's a danger in that kind of thinking, in that you expect people to be on one side or the other, and then whatever your initial perception of that person is, or the front they're putting on, or whatever, that's what level of spectrum, for want of a better word, I wish there was a better term, that you assign to them. And that's where your expectations go, and that's where your sort of your thought process is. You know, Chris Varney and I were giving a talk a couple of years ago now, and a teacher got up at the back, this sort of whole staff PD we were doing, and the teacher got up at the back and he said, I don't think either of you two are on the spectrum. You've just stood up and talked for 2 hours and you're fine. And I've never seen a principal turn that shade of purple. I was genuinely convinced she was going to like jump over chairs and beat this teacher. But that's the fact. You know, you get people who, you know, look at folks on the spectrum who have achieved, or, you know, are able to get up and talk, and they think, well, there's nothing wrong with you. And, you know, for certain parts of our community, unfortunately, that's been used as not like a talking point, or a soapbox, but it's been used to sort of segregate within our community. You know, well, you Aspergers, people who are the high functioning, you don't understand what it's like for us and that's not helpful. You know, I think you've got to look at people individually rather than simply assigning them a place on the spectrum and then having that be your starting position to move forward. You've got to start with the person and go.
So you mentioned before about things differing greatly based on day to day and different environments and things. How do you manage expectations around those?
I think the good example happened the other day here at the campus. I just finished meeting with one of my supervisors. So with a PhD, you've got 3 supervisors, your primary, and then you've got 2 secondaries. And I just finished meeting with my primary, and I went to get coffee, and both of my secondaries work in Sydney.
Okay.
And I'm standing there in the line, and the guy in front of me turns around, and it's one of my secondaries. And he's like, oh, Austin, hello, how are you? And I was, hang on. It took me a second for like my brain to sort of like, you're not supposed to be here.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the example. You know, I was very articulate in my first meeting, and then, because this one was not expected, it took me a second to get back my sort of command of the English language and not look like a clown. So yeah, it is very situational, I think.
And do you do anything to manage those expectations up front, or do you do anything to damage control when that happens?
Both. You know, I think there is a level of stigma around disclosing, and I think if you do that in a safe way and you do that with people that actually understand what that means, it's okay. So my primary and both my secondaries know that I'm on the spectrum.
Yep.
It's kind of hard to hide when I have a public profile as being on the spectrum, but still. And so that means that there's less damage that can be done by those sort of encounters. One of the damage control things I do a lot is humour. So, you know, you sort of self-deprecate, like, you know, if you're not expecting to see someone and so you fumble their names. Oh, I can't remember anyone's names. I'm just awful at this. Where's my PA? Like, someone come and tell me this person's name. You know, to sort of cover the fact that you just didn't 2 and 2 make 5. So yeah, both damage control and pre-planning I think is important.
All right, well, maybe we'll leave it there for today. Thanks, Austin. And stay tuned for more Aspie interviews later in the year. So thanks, bye.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for weekly content just like this one. If you'd like to get even more involved, you can join the discussion on social media or support me by becoming a patron. Finally, I value your time, and you'll notice all my videos are ad-free, so please help me to cover what you want to hear by leaving me a comment and telling me what you think. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you another time.